delighted to see you in person. It's wonderful to be back meeting in this form, though we are joined by others via Zoom. We are recording the lecture, the questions not, but when you put questions, we will be using the Chatham House rule. So I say, delighted to welcome you to the Michael Ryle Memorial Lecture, named after Michael Ryle, who's one of the founders of the Study of Parliament group. Indeed, without Michael, there would be no Study of Parliament group. When Bernard Crick published his seminal work, The Reform of Parliament, he had a letter from Michael Ryle. In those days, one couldn't text. He had a letter from Michael Ryle suggesting that perhaps the work would have benefited from knowledge provided by those who actually worked within Parliament. So the two got together, meeting of minds, and basically that was the origin of the Study of Parliament group. So Michael was always a very active member, served as an officer of the group, but continued to be very active in our work, even after he retired from the House service of the House of Commons, having served as clerk assistant in the House. So he was always excellent company, very enthusiastic, very keen to support the work of the group. And we're also delighted that members of the Ryle family are again with us for the lecture this evening. Now, our speaker is here, the Right Honourable Dame Eleanor Laing. Now, a solicitor by background, she served as special advisor to John McGregor when he was in the cabinet. She was elected to the House of Commons in 1997 as the member for Epping Forest. She variously served on the Conservative front bench in various positions, including as Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, and served on a range of select committees, including the joint, and I'd like to, very hard-working committee on the draft House of Lords Reform Bill. She was elected as a Deputy Speaker in 2013, and as the Deputy Speaker and Chairman of Ways and Means in 2020, becoming the first female in history to hold the position. She was sworn of the Privy Council in 2017 and received a damehood in 2018. And the title she's chosen for this evening's lecture is one that I'm sure Michael Ryle would very much have approved. Dame Eleanor is going to offer us the view from the chair. So will you give a very warm welcome to our speaker, Dame Eleanor Laing.
My Lord, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The view from this lectern is not quite like the view from the chair, where I'm used to looking down at a large number of people, most of whom don't really know what they're doing. As I just step up to this lectern now and look around this room, I see that I'm surrounded by some very learned personalities. And so I know that this evening, I'm not going to be telling you anything that you don't already know, but I hope that I might give you some food for thought and that we can have a discussion afterwards. Perhaps my brand new clerk, James, who's only been with us for 3 days, might learn something, but you can tell me afterwards, James, but I promise you the rest of them won't. But I'm absolutely delighted, Philip, to be here this evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to deliver the annual Michael Ryle Memorial Lecture. It is a great honor. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Michael, as some of you did, but I appreciate that he played a very significant role in the evolution of Britain's constitutional affairs, both as the founder of this very influential and learned group, and as one of the architects of the select committee system, which has been so outstandingly successful in recent years in holding the government, various governments, lots of governments, all governments, to account. this evening is a fitting tribute to his valuable contribution to Parliament. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, Parliament. I'm passionate about this place. I've worked in and around the House of Commons for some 33 years. It gave me a bit of a shock when I did that arithmetic calculation. Thought I'd got the arithmetic wrong. No, 33 years. I've been a member of Parliament for Epping Forest, which is a constituency in Essex, just at the end of the central line, since 1997. And I've been in the House during the tenure of Speaker Boothroyd, Speaker Martin, Speaker Bercow, and of course, Speaker Hoyle. I've seen firsthand the way in which the approach of the chair can influence the Commons. I've also experienced the different roles that MPs play throughout their time in the House and their different relationships to the chair. In my time, I've been a shadow minister and a backbencher, a member of the party of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, and a member of the party of government. Since 2013, when I became a deputy speaker, I've had a view from the chair rather than a view of the chair. So that is the title of my lecture tonight. I was elected Chairman of Ways and Means, as Philip has just said, in January 2020. As well as presiding over debates, I'm responsible, as most of you will know, for the budget debate and bills in committee of the whole House. I also oversee Westminster Hall, the panel of chairs, and private business. In my capacity as Chairman of Ways and Means, I'm supported by the two other deputy speakers and a brilliant team of clerks. I would particularly like to thank the clerk of the journals, the wonderful Eve Sampson, and my brilliant private secretary, LJ Tiley, for their invaluable assistance in helping me put together what I'm saying to you this evening. Although, of course, I have to say, Philip, that the words are my own and I take full responsibility for anything I say. Before becoming Deputy Speaker, many of my roles required reflection on different parts of our multifaceted constitution. I've been a member of the Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee, the Joint Committee, as you mentioned, on the House of Lords, which was really successful. Yes, the Joint Committee on Parliamentary Privilege and the Speakers Committee on the Electoral Commission. I was Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, Shadow Minister for Constitutional Affairs, Shadow Minister for Women, and an Opposition Whip. And long ago, I was Special Advisor to the Leader of the House of Commons at a time when we were pushing through very significant changes to the workings of the House. So I suppose I've observed this place from many different angles. My lecture today is about the chair's role in upholding parliamentary democracy and ensuring that Parliament can hold the government to account. Chairing debates in the chamber and overseeing other areas of parliamentary scrutiny as Chairman of Ways and Means is, as you can imagine, a complex business. The hours we spend in the chair each day are a privilege, but also a challenge. You have to be constantly alert, listening to the debate, assessing the mood of the room, intervening when needed. Order, order. Oh no, you're being so well behaved this evening. And also constantly thinking ahead, deciding who's going to speak, keeping an eye on the time and making sure the correct procedures are followed. It's rather like guiding an enormous battleship through stormy waters and into a safe haven. Well, hopefully into a safe haven when it all concludes bang on 10 o'clock and the mace is taken out. I always try to impress upon new members of Parliament the simple principle that the House and what happens in the chamber should always come first and foremost in their work. What happens in the chamber matters. As chair, it's my duty to ensure that every MP has the right to be heard and to hold the government to account. It's a fundamental principle of our democracy. Before I consider the role of the House and the chair in more detail, I'll look at the constitutional context for our work. The British Constitution is, of course, uncodified. Rather than being a single clear legal text, it's a mixture of key documents, understandings, and traditions which have developed over many centuries. Some are old, such as the position of the monarch as head of state. Some are very recent. For example, when the last but one prime minister, the original draft said last prime minister, but things moved on. When the last but one prime minister altered the code of conduct for ministers, a document which had only been introduced in 1997, some commentators claimed he was making constitutional changes. And I think probably he was. The doctrine of the separation of powers in the UK Constitution is also open to question, both as the extent to which it does exist and the extent to which it should exist. It's quite clear that the executive, parliament, and the judiciary have different functions. In the British system, however, parliament and the executive are fused. Ministers are, and as a matter of practical politics must be, members of one of the two houses. The relative separation of the judiciary from the other parts of the state is only very recent. When I was first elected, the Law Lords sat in the House of Lords and even took part in some debates. The fact that there isn't a codified constitutional document has strengths and weaknesses. I wrote an essay about this as a first-year law student in 1977. I think that's when I got hooked on the interest of constitutional affairs. I read that essay again recently. Oh, its writing was so neat. No word processors in 1977. I couldn't read my writing now, but I could read my student writing. And when I read it again, I still agree with my somewhat idealistic conclusion that the British Constitution is all the better for being unwritten. One strength is that our Constitution evolves. Let me turn for illustration to Anthony Trollope, of whom I'm a great devotee and whom I quoted at length in my maiden speech. When Plantagenet Palliser succeeded his uncle to become Duke of Omnium and thus had to move from the Commons to take his seat in the Lords, he lost his chance of the one job he really wanted, Chancellor of the Exchequer. It didn't stop him becoming Prime Minister, only stopped him becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer. Today, it's unthinkable that the Prime Minister could sit anywhere but the Commons. But today, succession to a dukedom would not be a bar to continuing to sit in the Commons. I rather think that Planty Powell would have supported the House of Lords Bill 1998, just as in the 1960s, he would have supported decimalisation, for which he fictionally paved the way almost a century earlier. But I digress. In fundamental ways, our Constitution stays the same. The power of the House of Commons has long rested on the fact that it alone can authorise expenditure and taxation. A fact which is particularly pleasing for me as the Chairman of Ways and Means. It remains unthinkable that the Chancellor would ever sit in the Lords, away from my jurisdiction. One very reasonable criticism of the unwritten nature of our Constitution is that it can be too easily altered without considering the wider picture or possible long-term effects. Until the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, the most senior person in the judiciary sat in the cabinet as Lord Chancellor. He, for they were all men, also led a government department and was Speaker of the House of Lords and voted on legislation. The first attempt to abolish the office had to be hastily abandoned as it was too deep-rooted in statute and indeed in the Constitution. Nonetheless, the 2005 Act finalized the separation of the judiciary from the executive and legislature by changing the status of the Lord Chancellor. Amongst other things, it asserted that the post holder would no longer act as head of the judiciary or as Speaker of the Lords. The changes to the status of Lord Chancellor were a worthy attempt to increase judicial independence. They have, however, been regretted by some senior members of the judiciary and indeed some former Lord Chancellors. There's a case made that the role of the courts and judiciary needs defending and protecting by someone who's part of the executive and legislature, and the internal challenge a Lord Chancellor could offer to both the executive and the courts was said to have been invaluable. I disagree. I would argue that the steps taken in 2005 towards a further separation of powers has strengthened our Constitution. The fact that the UK has a largely uncodified and wholly unentrenched constitution means that if Parliament agrees, radical changes can be made. It also means that those changes can be reversed speedily if that appears politically appropriate. There are circumstances in which the Constitution changes by evolution. For example, there's no law which says the Prime Minister cannot sit in the Lords, but radical change most usually requires the consent of Parliament. It's also true that some judgments in court can clarify the Constitution in ways which could be seen as constitutional change. That is an inescapable consequence of an independent judiciary. By contrast, changes which come from the law have at least the acquiescence of the executive or the legislature, which could, after all, legislate to reverse them. If, on the other hand, the judiciary was seen to be interpreting parliamentary intention in an overbearing way, there would be a constitutional crisis. So I would argue that Parliament is the key constitutional actor in the British Constitution. By that I mean the Crown in Parliament, which contains both executive and legislature. It is the only body which can make primary legislation. It's not the only player in constitutional development, but it is the key player. What role does the House of Commons play in all of this, apart from being part of the Crown in Parliament? First of all, the House of Commons retains its old constitutional role as the source of supply and forum for the redress of grievances. As the grand inquest of the nation, it allows members to raise individual cases and to make sure causes they care about are put on the policy agenda. The two are linked. Deal with our concerns or you won't get your money. The post of Chairman of Ways and Means is indissolubly linked to taxation, ways and means at the heart of this bargain. The House is also a key part of the legislature, and the increasing importance of statute law means any government will need to legislate. The House remains the constitutional institution which upholds the government, a more recent constitutional convention, but one which is linked to the House's ancient control of the purse strings. It always comes back to the control of the purse strings. The choice of who sat in the ministry in the 19th century in both fact and fiction depended on shifting coalitions of politicians, and indeed it still does. While the electoral principle is more important now, ability to command the support of one's colleagues remains vital. Indeed, the fact that winning elections does not guarantee continued office if you cannot control the House of Commons, which lies behind so many of Trollope's 19th century plots, has become all too obvious in recent months, weeks, days, hours. It's a perennial truism that truth is stranger than fiction. If Anthony Trollope, or indeed Geoffrey Archer or Michael Dobbs, had produced a dramatic plot in which the United Kingdom had 3 prime ministers and 2 monarchs in the space of 7 weeks, it might have been criticized by his publishers as being too far-fetched. In practice, however, we have just seen our Constitution triumph. It has accommodated the principle that a government which loses the confidence of the House does not survive. A leader of the government who loses the confidence of the House does not survive, although the function of governing itself, of course, continues seamlessly. A still more modern constitutional development is ministerial accountability. The most vital role of the House is enabling its elected members to hold ministers to account. If you say that an executive survives because of what it says to the House, the same can be said of a minister. Everything is scrutinized, everything is recorded, and it acts as a forum in which the still more recent constitutional development of party politics can function. Nowadays, opposition parties can not only challenge the government, but also set out alternative visions for government. It's easy to think of these processes as things which happen behind closed doors in stuffy meetings, or alternatively in press articles or on the airwaves, or through raising matters in correspondence with ministers. All of that does happen. I would argue, however, that what happens inside the chamber is still more important than what happens outside it. Debate remains fundamental to our parliamentary democracy. Debates tell you whether ministers know their stuff, whether a government has a coherent line, whether there's a good reason for policy, whether the opposition's criticisms are well-founded and its policies well-developed. Debates test their participants. Debates on the floor of the House are often wrongly characterized as being one extreme or the other. Either they are aggressive bear pits, such as in PMQs, or tedious, poorly attended Thursday afternoons. In fact, debates perform many functions, and trust me, I've sat through them all. Yes, one of the main tests of sitting in the chair is that you have to stay awake at all times, and that can be such a challenge. I have known myself call order, order in order to stand up and take a deep breath, just so I could get oxygen to my brain and not fall asleep. But that's very rare, of course, very rare indeed. Let's start by examining the lowest key debate, the daily adjournment. It might not be the most well-attended of debates, and the topics might not set the world alight, but it still has a value. The minister has to engage with the topic, be briefed on the issues, and provide a response on behalf of the government. Similarly, Westminster Hall debates are not always the most high-profile events, although the parliamentary broadcasting team tell me that petitions debates give PMQs a good run for their money in terms of viewership. Who would have believed it? Ah, Mark Darcy would. I see. But they allow members to bring forward important issues that matter to their constituents, to campaign groups, or in the case of the Petitions Committee, to a significant portion of the public. Westminster Hall, of course, is different from the Chamber, and it's meant to be different from the Chamber. It's smaller and more intimate. There is less performance. Debate is thoughtful, cooperative, and deliberate. Ministers are, in some ways, more exposed. There's a personal dialogue between the member and the minister. Ministers are far more likely to commit to responses when they're in dialogue with another member in an otherwise silent room than if they're barracking at each other across the busy chamber. So Westminster Hall has its own unique purpose, but it's the chamber which rightly commands most attention, and where the chair's role is most influential and challenging. Winston Churchill famously said that we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. He fiercely defended the adversarial rectangular setup of the chamber, which enables the two-party system that is the essence of British democracy. When it was suggested after the war, when the chamber was being rebuilt, that it should be like many European chambers in the shape of a horseshoe. I have always considered Churchill's defense of the current shape of our chamber to be one of his greatest achievements. The benefit of our bipartisan stage set is so apparent every day during question time. Members look ministers in the eye and ask them questions directly. Ministers look back and sometimes they answer the question. So how does the chair interact with all these principles? How does the chair help make the House work? First, I should say that the Speaker and his deputies work very much as a team. Every day that the House sits, the Speaker and deputies meet with the Clerk of the House and the clerks on duty at the table that day for the Speaker's conference. At that meeting, which takes under half an hour, we discuss the day's business. It's probably the most important and least known meeting in Parliament. It's terribly important because it means that we have a common understanding of the day's business and a common approach to issues which might arise. We also discuss applications for urgent questions. David Nasler presided along with Speaker Bercow to the massive expansion of the use of UQs. Yeah, I'm blaming you, David. No, actually, I think I'm giving you credit. UQs used to be very rare, very rare. If you had one a month, then that was quite a lot. But the doctrine of the UQ has expanded very significantly. And we discuss applications for urgent questions at the morning meeting. Although Standing Order number 14, as all of you know, provides for government business to have precedence at every sitting, an urgent question may be inserted immediately after departmental questions because it is a genuinely new issue of real importance. At least it sometimes is. A UQ might sometimes be used as a device to draw out a government position if ministers have been unforthcoming with a statement about a matter of serious public concern. In discussions about the decision, the Speaker and the team will consider whether the request is truly time critical, whether it has national significance, the impact on other business that day, and whether there are multiple applications for the same topic. And it will also consider the government position. We have a constant battle to make ministers come to the dispatch box to make policy announcements to the House. This is not just some archaic rule. It's the very essence of an accountable democracy that the executive must come to Parliament to announce and gain approval for government policy. And ministers must come here first, before they go to the TV studios, because it is MPs, not journalists or lobbyists, who have the duty to hold the government to account on behalf of the people who elect us. The challenge of the chair in every decision is to balance a wide array of competing principles and interests. Members' freedom of speech and the rules of the House, the right of the government to have its business considered, the right of non-government members to scrutinise ministers, and the need to ensure that the House can function effectively without exhausting its members through a succession of late nights. As Chairman of Ways and Means, I'm responsible for selection and grouping of amendments and selection of amendments for division during Committee of the Whole House. It used to be the case that if an amendment was selected for debate, it would also be voted upon. The introduction of programming and the move away from open-ended sittings late into the night and beyond has many benefits, one of which, and this might not have been intentional when it was introduced, but one of which is that it gives more control to the chair. The occupant of the chair must balance the need for debate with the need for opposition parties to be able to vote on matters which concern them. I also need to ensure matters where there is a real uncertainty about the outcome of a vote do get put to the House, all while not keeping the House ridiculously late, which is often a poor use of members' time. Because debate in the House is so important, what is said in the House is protected. The principle of parliamentary privilege means that the House has the right to talk about what it wants. This principle has been established for a long time. There were some squabbles about how far it extended with the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, but ultimately it has been in statute since the 1688 Bill of Rights. That doesn't mean, however, that the House operates without rules. What it means is that the rules are set by the House itself, formally and informally. The chair has the privilege of enforcing and sometimes setting these rules. Members do not always wish to obey them, but they must, because proper debate needs parameters. Some are long established and exist because they've been found to work. Others are the result of more recent decisions, such as the rules relating to matters which are sub judice. I will always defend the House of Commons adversarial setup, but there is a balance to strike. If the chamber is not an attractive place in which members can comfortably make a speech, then they will make their speech elsewhere. It's a vital duty of the occupant of the chair, therefore, to ensure that every member has the chance to be heard, and that when tempers are running high, the quieter, more cerebral members are not just shouted down. This is precisely why our rules are so important. Being discourteous in the chamber means being discourteous to Parliament, and therefore being discourteous to the constituents we are elected to represent. One of the hardest things to police is the principle that, as Erskine May says, good temper and moderation. I can hear Philippa saying that. I can hear Philippa stage whispering it from the table to the Speaker's chair. Good temper and moderation are the characteristics of parliamentary language. The conventions and courtesies of the House have evolved to help support this, and so has the loud voice. Order, order. For example, members must address their remarks through the chair. You'd be amazed how many members don't understand what that means. There are perfectly good reasons for it. This mode of address is more than a traditional custom of the House. It's a deliberate device to depersonalize interaction in the chamber. It moderates debate and makes criticism less direct. There's a significant difference in tone between a member saying, "Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is mistaken in his statement of the facts," rather than, "You are wrong." I have an ongoing battle to make some members understand the difference between the second person and the third person. I must take this up with the Secretary of State for Education, because I think it is likely that some of the members who now sit in the Commons are products of those decades when grammar wasn't properly taught in schools. Likewise, the rule against accusing another member of lying is not just a quaint nicety. It's perfectly proper to debate a member's personal conduct on a substantive motion, as we've seen recently. That is part of accountability. What is improper is to make slurs or accusations against someone who may not be there to defend themselves. The prohibition on casual accusations of misconduct not only helps keep tempers in the chamber, at least it does sometimes, it also these days, very importantly, prevents such accusations being clipped and disseminated on social media. It can be a difficult balance to achieve. The chair has to allow members the freedom to question. It can be very difficult to detect that something is going to be said until it's too late. And then one has the dilemma that intervention from the chair might draw attention to the remark, and sometimes it's therefore best just left to fade. This is something we frequently discuss amongst the speaker's team. As members increasingly try to break the spirit of the rule while keeping to the letter, we are becoming more and more willing to intervene and to challenge. Behind the scenes, there are several things we do to remind members of the rules. We have quiet words with members. We sometimes write formal letters, and the ultimate is we just tell someone that instead of being called early in a debate, they're going to be called last because they have behaved badly. That tends to be the most useful weapon in the chair's armory. Most effective debates are the ones in which members come to the chamber ready to exchange ideas and listen to one another. The exchanges in UQs and statements are mostly spontaneous, since there's little or no notice of what the minister will say or what others will ask. And this may be one reason why actually UQs and statements are growing in significance. But that spontaneity would benefit other debates as well. A speech in the House of Commons ought to be made with a few notes on a small bit of paper. It should not be read out verbatim from an iPad. Some bad habits were formed while we had hybrid proceedings during the pandemic. I'm constantly encouraging members to get back to normal and a higher standard of debate. There's quite a difference between properly engaging in a debate and just reading out your 3-minute essay as if you were reading it for your teacher at school. We need to get back to a better level of rhetoric in the House, where members feel able to take an intervention and have the confidence to know they can also finish their speech without losing the thread of what they're saying. As a debate proceeds, it's sometimes necessary for the chair to set time limits. There's a careful balance to strike between ensuring that as many members as possible have the opportunity to contribute to a debate by setting shorter time limits and allowing more time for members to make proper speeches on heavyweight subjects. And that can be a very difficult balance to achieve. I'm always reminding members that succinctness in speech making is powerful. It's amazing how many people forget that brevity is the soul of wit. So that, my lord, brings me to my conclusion. Debate in the House of Commons, when done properly, reinforces a sense of common purpose. It can be difficult in the present day to keep a sense of collective institution. But this is precisely what the House of Commons is. Its purpose is not to oppose policy blindly, but to ensure that the policy put forward has proper discussion and scrutiny. At key moments in history, such as the pandemic and the death of Her late Majesty the Queen, the House of Commons rightly plays a central role. It is a collective cross-party institution. I hope that tonight I've given you some insight into how the chair endeavours to protect the precious institution that is Parliament. It is my ambition that the chamber of the House of Commons, not the TV studios or the Twitter sphere, will continue forever to be the main focus and forum for our national debate. Thank you very much.